Welcome to the farm stand tutorial. This watercolor is going to help us to show shadows and shine on fruit and to give it dimension and make it look real. You want to start off with making sure that you have Misket available. You want to make sure that you have salt available. You're also going to be using different brushes today. So you want to gather those up before you begin. You're going to use your fan brush. You're going to be using a number 6 round, 4 round, 2 round, and a fine rigger. You'll also be using your nice wide brush or any wide brush that you have to color in or to paint in the biggest spaces. For colors this evening, you're going to be using cadmium yellow, and you can use cad yellow light or medium. You're also going to be using yellow ochre. You'll be using burnt umber, which is your dark brown. You'll be using black. You'll be using sap green. Sap green is a nice olive green, but if you don't have sap green, you can simply use any green that you have and just add a little bit of the burnt umber to it, just a very little bit, and that will give you a nice olivey green. We're also going to be using either an alizarin crimson or some of your red. We'll also be using some Chinese white for our highlights at the very end. When you do your drawing, you want to draw your vegetables, at least the perimeters of your vegetables, and I misketed in my stem and all of the little white filigree areas of my flowers in the middle of my flowers, the little yellow worm-like pieces, so that I could keep them nice and crisp and clean. We're going to start off painting our tomato, and you want to paint your tomato with a nice red color. If you only have alizarin crimson, you can add a little bit of yellow to it and a little tiny bit of burnt umber to it, and that will give you more of a reddish tone. Otherwise, you want to use your cadmium red. You want to put it on very wet so that you can go back in and spread other colors through the wet red. So put it on really nice and wet so that you won't have to worry about it drying on you. Once you've painted it all in, you're still nice and wet. You can see I can go over any part of my tomato and I am still nice and wet. You want to put in some cad yellow rather intensely on those crack lines that you see in your tomato. Put it on rather intense, allow it to bleed through your wet red, and make sure when you're putting that on, it's also very wet, because that's the only way it's going to blend and bleed. I also dropped in a little bit of that yellow in different areas of my tomato, just so that my tomato wouldn't just be a flat red ball. Our peppers are sap green, nice and wet. I'm going to paint them individually. You can paint over the entire pepper, including the stem, including anything. It does not matter. You want to paint over everything. I did allow my front pepper to dry before I painted the back pepper, but at this point it really wouldn't matter because the shadowing that we do on the peppers will certainly separate them out. But nice and wet. I always suggest, too, to try to watch your video a few minutes ahead of where you're actually painting so you know what to expect. Because sometimes if you're trying to paint along at the exact same time as the video, I'm doing things that you weren't prepared for. So watch about 3 or 4 minutes ahead, back it up, and then go ahead and paint it. It's just much easier, and then you'll be prepared for anything that I might have to say. Now we'll move down to our yellow pepper. I used a little bit of yellow ochre mixed with my yellow. And I'm doing again it nice and wet. I'm not doing the top to this pepper though, because the top to this pepper is green. So I'm only doing the yellow part of the pepper, painting it in nice and wet. And then I'm going to get a little bit of my red, very watered down, and I'm going to drag that red through parts of my pepper that I want to have more of an orangey tone to it, especially the area down by the tomato, because that tomato color is reflecting off of the shiny skin of the pepper. Now you want to make sure everything is really dry before you start working on your flower, because you don't want your flower petals to bump into a wet tomato, because then the color will spread to your flower and to your tomato. I'm using just yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of burnt umber, and I am painting in all of the dark lines and darker areas of my flower petal. If you look at your picture, they are very evident. So what you see in your picture as your darker lines, that's what you want to paint with this yellow ochre and umber mixture. You can simply paint it in. You can do a little bit of dry brushing. There are still going to be a lot of white spots. Those will get painted in later. But you want to paint in all of the sections that you see as darker. Don't have to paint this all at one time. You can be going back to your flower petals as you're waiting for things to dry. But you do want to paint your darker colors in before you put your final color on, which will be your cadmium yellow. Going back now to our little yellow pepper, we're going to use our sap green to paint in the entire top to the pepper. This would be the stem and the top to the pepper. You don't have to separate it and paint it separately. It can be painted all at one time. And then once you've done that, you want to dry everything really well, because now we will start to give shape and texture to our peppers. So you want to pay special attention now to your picture, because you're going to be following your picture to paint in and shape your peppers. If you look at the top to the pepper, there are darker parts to that top. Those darker parts are just going to be painted in with another wash of your sap green, a little bit more intense. And on some of the areas, actually most of the areas, you'll soften the edges with water. So you're going to be going around that whole top rim to your pepper. We'll do the stem separately. And you're going to paint in those sections that are darker, and you're going to water off the edge just with plain water. When you do that, be sure you rinse your brush and be sure that you tap it on a piece of paper towel or Kleenex so you just don't get a big drop of water that falls on your paper. And you're going to work your way all around the top to your pepper. You'll also notice some areas of the stem that are darker, and you'll do the same thing. However, you want to make sure that the outer part of your pepper top is dry before you do the stem, so that it all just doesn't run together. Then you'll repeat that same process on your other pepper. Now there are parts of your pepper that are also deeper in color because your pepper's color is not exactly consistent, the entire pepper. So I'm wetting the areas first that I want to add additional color. And once I wet them, then when I add that additional sap green color, it will have a nice soft edge to it because the paper is wet. So it'll blend and bleed naturally because of the wet paper. So wherever you want to put that darker color, it can be just in one place or everywhere. You want to wet it first just with plain water. Be careful not to keep going over and over and over it so you don't lift the color you already have down. But just make sure it's nice and wet so that when you add that color, you'll have a nice soft edge to it. I'm leaving some of my original color. I don't want to have, a color, a wash color over the entire pepper because then that defeats the purpose of what we're doing to change the color and the consistency of one solid color. So you don't want to just go over the entire pepper with additional color because then you've defeated the purpose of what you're trying to do. You want some of your original coloring to stay behind. Now you'll repeat that process on your other green pepper, but now I want to go in on my yellow pepper and I'm doing the same thing. I'm wetting some areas that I want to put in a little bit of additional red to give it an orangey color. So just where I want to add some additional color, I'm wetting it so it can have a nice soft blend. Adding in a little bit of color, allowing it to blend and bleed through the wetness so that I have a nice soft edge. If for some reason you don't get a soft edge, then go ahead and wet your brush and soften the edge with some water because you don't want specific lines. You want just some ripening color on your pepper. Now I'm going back to my tomato and I've mixed some sap green with some yellow so that I have a nice yellow green. And I'm going over those crack lines and putting some yellow green in the middle of those crack lines. That won't be the last color. There will be a dark brownish black in those cracks also. So when you're putting these additional colors on, you want to make sure that they're wide enough to accommodate another stripe of color. While I'm working in that green, I'll go ahead and take some additional dark green. You can mix it with a little bit of black if you would like, just a very little bit to deepen the green. And I'm going to put that deepest green now on my pepper at the top. I'm not re-wetting my pepper for a third time. I'm just going to put it on where I would like to have a little bit of extra color, and I'm just going to soften the edge with water. The centers for the flowers are painted in with our yellow green. That's a little bit of sap mixed with some yellow ochre. And I'm painting in that whole center. I'm going to dry that with just the yellow green on before I add my darker color. And the reason I'm doing that is I don't want those colors to mix. I want the salt that I'm going to put on when I put on my darker color to just lift a little bit of my darker color here and there to show my yellow green. If I put it on when it was wet, then the colors would just mix together, and even though the salting would work, it would not take me back to my yellow-green color. It would take me back to my original paper cutter, which is color, which is not what I want. So after you get your yellow-green on, you want to dry it. And then you are going to put on a wash of burnt umber mixed with a little bit of black, and you're going to salt that wash. Here's your umber and black. I'm painting that on my whole center. My green color is already dry. A little bit of salt. That's going to help to texture it. And I'll do the same thing with the other center. Then you want to make sure that everything is really dry once your salt starts to work and starts to give you those little texture dots. And then you want to try to brush off as much as you can so that it doesn't interfere with the future things you're doing. Now we're taking that same umber and black color and we are putting a little strip in those cracks of your tomato. Don't cover the green, don't cover the yellow. This is in addition to that. So your yellow should have been wide enough to accommodate a little stripe of green, and your green should be wide enough to accommodate this little section of umber and black. And then I'm salting my umber and black. Now the fun begins because you're going to start to shadow your peppers. And using just some black, you're going to lift that top section of your pepper right off away from your pepper just by adding a little bit of black. So you want to look at your picture, and where you see those black V-shaped shadows, you're going to put in your black and you're going to soften the edges with water. All the way around that stem. And what that will do is that'll separate your stem from your pepper, separate the top of that pepper from the actual pepper just by putting on some black. It'll make it look as if it's lifted up. Take your time. Do one or two at a time. Don't try to hurry and do them all at one time. Make sure you soften the edges. Make sure that you get them dry so that you're not running into wet over wet over wet. And take your time. You can already see how it looks like the top to that pepper, those sections are lifted up and causing a shadow on the actual pepper piece. So paint it in with your black, soften around the edge with your water. By softening it, it lessens the intensity of the black and only leaves it be intense up close where it should be. And you're going to do that the whole way around. Where you see where you're trying to shape and give some shape to the pepper to make it look like it has bubbles on its surface or half bubbles, you're doing that just with your black paint and softening the edge. You're going to do that with both peppers. And then you'll start to shadow the bottom sides of the peppers because there's no light there. And you'll do it the same way, painting it in with some black and then softening the edge. Follow your picture. Your picture will show you exactly where you need to put these dark shadows. You don't have to try to figure it out on your own. Just follow your picture. You're going to be doing the exact same thing with your tomato and with your yellow pepper. Don't worry yet about the shadows on the table. We are just doing the shadows on the underside of the tomato and the pepper and all the peppers. And this is where there's no light. Your light source is coming from the left. So most of your dark shadowing is going to be on the right or the underside of the right. You have to know where your light source is coming from, and then that will make shadowing so much easier for you. Now you're going to paint in all of your petals on your flower, and they are just going to be painted in cad yellow. Painted right over the color you already have down. You'll paint in the full petal cadmium yellow. Each petal is the same color. Now we're going to start to do some fine tuning. If you want more shadowing on any of your peppers, if you feel it needs it, now's the time to do it. If you want to add some more texture to your peppers, you can dry brush with the color of your pepper to give it a little bit of rough texturing. You can do whatever you want on your peppers. If you want to put a little wash of your green and water the edge off and throw some salt on it, you can do that also. Whatever you want to do to show a little bit of extra texture, if you want that, now is the time that you want to do that. Now you're going to detail your yellow pepper stem and top, just like you did on the green peppers, with your black. If you look at your picture, you'll see actual shapes where it needs textured in or where it needs painted in. And by painting in those shapes, that will pop out your top for you. When everything is done, you want to go ahead and dry everything real well. And you're going to wet your background just with plain water. And you can do it in sections. You don't have to hurry up and try to do it all at one time. But while it's wet, I just dragged through some color. And my color was just a little bit of my red and green kind of mixed together, made kind of a mauvey pink color. But I just want to drag through some color. I don't want color everywhere because I like my white background. So I put it mainly around my my veggies, like on the underneath side, under my flour. But then I extended some color up to the top of my paper and then down to the bottom of my paper. So wet it first so that you have a really nice soft blend of this very light color. And then when you put the color on, I went ahead and salted where I put the color on. And you'll see that completed step next. Just wetting the background, dragging that color through. Now you can see exactly where I dragged through a little bit of color, and I threw some salt on. You want to make sure that your veggies are real dry because you don't want your background and your veggies to start to bleed together. Throw on the salt where you put your color in on your background and allow that salting to work and give you some texturing because this is on a woven tablecloth. Not that you have to keep it that way, but this is what that coloring is. And then once it's textured and the salt has worked, I'm going to dry it really well, brush off all of the salting really well, because when I start to put in my shadows under my veggies, I cannot have salt markings in my shadows. So you want to make sure you get all of your salting off before you start any of your shadowing under your veggies. Now using my fan brush, I'm going to use that same color that I washed into my background. My background should be totally dry. My salt is all removed. And I'm going to use that fan brush just to paint in some weave lines to show that this is a weaved tablecloth. Just a few, I'm not getting crazy with it, but I just want my eye to catch those weave lines, because by doing that, it's going to tell my brain or anybody looking at it that it's a woven tablecloth. You want to have your weave lines going both horizontally and or vertically or diagonally, but you don't want them going in all directions. You don't want some diagonal, some vertical, some horizontal. Either do diagonal in two different directions or vertical and horizontal, but don't get crazy and start going in all directions. Don't do too many. Just do enough to give the impression of a nice weaved cloth. If you want to do any splattering with the same color, just put something over your nice veggies before you start to splatter with your fan brush. because you don't want polka dotted fruit. So before you start to do a little bit of splattering, make sure you put a Kleenex over them, especially the light colored ones, so that you don't get any spots. Now I put a couple little darker spots in on some of the weave lines just to enhance where the weaves crisscrossed. So I made just like a little L shape just to enhance some of the weave lines with a little bit of a darker color. Not a lot, just a few here and there. That's all you need. Painted in my flower stems with sap green, and then I'm going to be doing my last steps, which will be the shadows on the cloth from the veggies. These will be done with black, and the edges will be softened with water. Now, if you feel more comfortable softening that whole area on the cloth with water first, and then adding your shadow, you can do that. That's perfectly fine. But you want to make sure that your shadows are horizontal. They shouldn't really be too much at an angle. They should kind of, be horizontal because you're showing how they are sitting on the cloth on a flat surface. This is just done with black, and then the edges are softened. Follow your picture. Everywhere where you see the shadows in your picture, that's where you put the shadows on your painting. Some of the shadows are more intense than others, and they are usually more intense where the vegetable actually touches the cloth and the table. And then that shadow lessens in intensity as it moves out. So right under the vegetable is where your shadow will be darker, and you can just make it more intense while it's wet. Or if you prefer, you can make it more intense with an additional wash when it's dry. But you want to make sure you soften those shadows. You want to make sure they're nice and dark where they should be nice and dark. And all of your items get shadowed. The tomato, the peppers, the flower, the bud, the flower center that's laying on the cloth, and the yellow pepper. They all have a shadow. Again, don't hurry. There's no reason for you to hurry through this. You can do one shadow every day if that's what you're comfortable doing. But don't hurry because you don't want to mess up something that you've just been working on for 2 hours or 3 hours or 3 days because you're in a hurry to get in those last shadows. Take your time. shadow under that flower center laying on the table, shadow behind your flower next to the tomato because it's casting a shadow on the tablecloth behind it, but it won't be an intense shadow because it's not right up against the tablecloth. It's farther away from the tablecloth. So your shadows will be less intense. Now dry everything really well, because the last thing that you're going to do for shadowing is going to be those few shadows that you actually see on the petals to the flower. Not a lot, there's just a few petals that are casting a shadow, and it's most likely either a petal overhanging another petal or that big center piece that is overhanging a petal. So you'll put your black on and soften the edge. These are not too intense either because the petal is not right up against the center, so they're not quite as intense in color. Just make sure that you soften the edge. Once everything is done on your shadows, you can take your Misket off, both on the tomato stem and on the centers for your flowers, and that will bring you back to your white paper. Just brush it off with your finger, but that will take you back to nice clean white paper. That's the purpose of Misket, so that now we can put on some nice light green and we didn't have to paint around all of those little small areas every time. My stem I'm painting in with some sap green, and once it's dry, I will go ahead in and shadow some of the sections of the stem just to help to give it dimension. Now I'm taking the Misket off of those flower centers. If you didn't do it before, take your Misket off, and again, that's taking you back to white. You don't want white, so I'm going to paint over that with my yellow green, my sap mixed with a little bit of yellow, and that color will stand out because it's lighter than the dark brown color that's the center. If you want it to be a different color, if you want it to be simply yellow, that's fine too. But I am going to add some little yellow dots at the very end just to perk up some of my really dark parts of my center. Perfect. I'm painting in that little piece of petal that's left on that center. I'll just paint that in with my yellow. Put a little bit of shadow on it when it's dry. Make sure my stem has some shadowing on it so it shows some dimension. You don't want it to be flat, so you have to add the black shadows on there to shape it. And then once you are happy with all of your shadowing, all of your coloring, then you will put on your white highlights. The white highlights do not come until everything is done and you are happy with it. Because once you put your white highlight on, you cannot paint over it. So you want to make sure that you are happy with everything about your painting before you go to the white. Chinese white you have to put on rather intensely, because if you don't, it dries almost translucent. That doesn't mean you want to glob it on real thick. It still can be nice and wet, but you want to put it on intensely. You may have to put it on a couple times, and that's fine, but you want to make sure that each wash is totally dry before you add more, because otherwise you'll just get a mixture of the white and the color and you won't be getting your nice white shine. So I put that nice white triangle on my little yellow pepper. I'm going to soften the edge with water. I'm going to put a nice white circle of shine on my tomato. And I'm going to put some shapes of shine on my green peppers. They are very evident in the picture, so if you look at your picture, you will know exactly where you want to put your shine. You want to wet that area first, wet way outside the area so that your white will have room to bloom or bleed, and you'll get a nice soft edge. And again, you can always add more, but you don't want to keep going over it and over it and over it if it's not dry, because all you'll do is mix your white with your green and get a light green, or mix your white with your red and get a pink. That's not what you want. You want to do as few strokes as possible when you're putting on your highlights. And last but not least, I'm using my cadmium yellow, and I'm adding in some yellow dots on my flower centers just to have some nice light spots pop out. I'm doing that with a very fine brush, and it's just my yellow ochre, or cadmium yellow. Perfect. Looks real enough to eat. Enjoy your painting, and always happy painting.